So I am very happy tonight to introduce the speaker for this evening's presentation in our International Development Lecture Series. And this is Dr. Lynn Sanford Kester, who recently retired, actually just in 2012, after 25 years of teaching developmental psychology at the University of Montana, Missoula, and also at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. In her past career, she also taught in Head Start and early childhood programs, and how I know her is that she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia. She's conducted research in Austria, Germany, and Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. before she moved here to Missoula. And she's also the founding director of a wonderful Peace Corps Master's program here at the University of Montana. It was the University of Montana's Global Youth Development Graduate Program affiliated with the U.S. Peace Corps. Her research has focused on a bunch of different topics, primarily on infant development within the family context, with a particular focus on deaf babies, early parent-child interactions, and the concept of intuitive parenting. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And she's published a lot of different articles. Her most recent book, which she co-authored with Patricia Spencer, is titled Nurturing Language and Learning, Development of Deaf and Hard of Hearing Infants and Toddlers. And this was published just this year by Oxford University Press. So join me in welcoming Dr. Kester, and I'll be helping tonight with the audiovisual. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Small but passionate audience.
Okay, good. Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's fun to be back with students at UM. I am still on campus a lot, but not so much engaged with students anymore. So I want to start by saying that what I'm going to present tonight will not be a lot of facts and theories and figures and statistics, but a lot of questions for you to think about. And mostly they're questions about our assumptions regarding child development or development across the lifespan, mostly focused on children. And that, of course, involves parenting and what does our culture say, your culture say, about the way we should treat babies and young children and kids as they grow up. So I'll be posing a lot of questions, and feel free, as Teresa said, to stop along the way and give me some thoughts about your answers and how some of these cultural assumptions maybe have played out in your own life or your own observations, or friends and people you know who have young children. I've also included a lot of pictures here, mostly for fun. They don't necessarily all illustrate exactly what the point is of a particular slide, but most of them are from either my Peace Corps experience or from having more recently been back to Ethiopia, where I served in Peace Corps, and continuing to do some work with colleagues there. And the page down does not seem to be working. Okay, there we go. Okay, yes. So first we need to think a little bit about what we mean by culture. And is culture specific to human beings? I think because culture is so imbued with or intertwined with language, most people do think about it as being kind of specific to humanity. Michael Cole, a very well-known person in this field, has said that culture enables us to create those continuities that we need between the past and the future. And so if you think about that in terms of child rearing, starting with infancy, we begin to impart cultural expectations in very tiny babies even, expectations about whether their needs should be met immediately as soon as they cry or not, expectations about whether they're to be cared for by a large number of people, maybe beyond their own family, or whether their primary caregivers are only the mother and the father. So a lot of these variations really relate to the culture that a child is born into. Some other scholars in the field, Charles Super and Sarah Harkness, developed the idea of developmental niche. And I think this is kind of a nice way to think about the ways in which children grow up, because it helps us to locate a child not just in their physical environment, that's of course important, but in the social cultural environment, which may be even more important. And so, yes, there's the physical social setting, but also within the social cultural environment, then those expectations that are passed on from one generation to the next about not only what the long-term outcome should be, what do we want this child to grow up to be like, but also how do we impart that cultural knowledge even at a very young age. So these child-rearing attitudes and beliefs are a large part of what I'll be talking about tonight. And within that concept of developmental niche, there are three basic components. So the first one that was mentioned on the slide previously are the physical surroundings, the environment that includes not only does this child live in an elaborate condominium somewhere or in a small grass hut or in a very impoverished or very wealthy kind of physical environment. Within that environment, who are the other people who are part of that child's social, cultural, developmental niche? So again, you have to think about this as not just being the nuclear family. That tends to be the way most Western parents sort of automatically think about child rearing, as taking place within their own little family unit. But that's not by any means the norm in many, many parts of the world. And one of the variations there that we see across cultures is whether or not there are multiple generations living under the same roof. So is it the grandmother and an aunt and several other people who are primarily taking care of the infants and babies in the family? Are there maybe even cousins and a lot of extended family children in the same environment? And those kinds of things, those variations, make a big difference in how a child is going to grow up. The next component of this developmental niche is the idea of child rearing practices that I mentioned previously. You're probably familiar with this notion of informal versus formal learning. Formal learning is pretty self-evident. That's what happens when you're in a classroom here at the university, or you're learning to drive, or you're taking music lessons, or children are in preschool. The informal learning we often neglect when we think about learning outcomes for children, but the informal learning has to do with what all of the information they absorb just by being in the world, by observing how people interact in the grocery store, by observing the way their families are treated when they get on a bus, by hearing the news on the television or seeing horrible images of news events in the newspaper that's lying on the kitchen counter. So all of these informal, kind of almost incidental learning episodes take place many, many, many times during every day in the life of a child. And again, we make a mistake if we think that this only starts when children go to school. We have to think about this as really starting pretty much from day one. And then one of the sort of long-term goals that varies a lot from culture to culture is whether a child is primarily expected to grow up to be his or her own sort of very self-confident, autonomous being, or whether the child is primarily expected to be a contributor to the larger community. So independence, dependence, again, this kind of training starts early, and in the Western world, our developmental theorists, such as you may have heard the name Erik Erikson, developed a long lifespan theory of development, and he thought that one of the first tasks in toddlerhood, anyway, was for a child to develop autonomy, a sense of independence, of selfhood, and of being able to act on their own without so much regard for other people, not disregard, but primarily being able to be rather independent. Eating and sleeping schedules and practices, we'll get into this a little bit more later when we talk about some of the specifics, but as we approach that, begin to think about what your own background tells you or what your own observations and knowledge of other people tells you in terms of whether or not children should be fed on demand as babies. Whenever the baby cries, it gets offered a bottle or a breast, or also sleeping schedules. Does the baby sleep with the parents, sleep with other siblings, sleep in its own crib from day one? So these are some of the things that we'll be addressing in a little more detail. And then finally, within this developmental niche, we have to think about the caregivers themselves. What are their expectations and their goals for their children? What are their parenting styles? Is this a parent or a family in which the parents are sort of the ultimate authority and the children are sort of ruled with a very tight rein and pretty authoritarian? Or is it much more permissive? The children learn from each other and maybe from their mistakes and their accidents and so forth, but they're not so much controlled by the adults in their environment. And that, of course, all ties in with child-rearing beliefs as well. So I put this picture in here to have us sort of think a little bit about what this tells us about cultural differences regarding children and where they are allowed to be left alone or needing constant supervision. What does this conjure up for you?
It's kind of surprising. I don't think that would really happen here.
To see children left on the bicycles asleep in front of a store.
In fact, the parents would probably be sued or taken away to jail.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Didn't they sue someone, much older kids that they let go to the park alone or something? Oh, come on.
Yeah, there was an incident, I think in New York a few years ago, with a Danish family that left a child in a stroller outside of a coffee shop. And mom and dad went in, had their lattes, and they were enjoying themselves, and the child was sound asleep. And they came out, and either the child was gone or the police were there, or someone from Protective Services had literally been called because this was so out of the norm for New York City. But in Germany, and I've spent a fair amount of time in Germany, and this kind of scene is really pretty common. And you don't worry about it. And I found that I was perceived, or American parents were in general sort of perceived by a lot of Germans as being overly protective of our children. You know, so children were out riding their bikes on the streets much earlier than I would feel comfortable having our grandkids do here, that sort of thing. And so I think one of the reasons that people feel comfortable leaving their children like this is that there's much more a sense of everyone is watching out for them. It's not a village in Africa necessarily, but still there's more of a communal kind of sense of others are there to protect them. So it's a safety issue, I guess, that we tend to be much more concerned about here, and maybe that's changed in Germany in the meantime as well. Yes?
Well, I mean, I just wanted to contribute because I just got back from studying abroad in Germany, but it is like, you'll see like little, maybe 5-year-old kids riding the bus on their own.
Yes.
And that would just be like, if I saw a little 5-year-old on the bus in Missoula by themselves,
Right.
I would, I would immediately like ask if their parents were around, or like,
Right.
if I would assume that they were like a homeless kid or something like that, but it was completely normal in Germany for kids to just take the bus down to the park and just play in the park by themselves,
Yeah.
and then take it back home.
Right.
And the buses there were like, Americans would perceive them to be way more dangerous because there's so many more people like than here in Missoula. I would say, just it's funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can't report in Germany, but I have seen the stroller with the kid outside the shop in Portugal recently. So
Yeah.
looks familiar. This is an awfully cute photo, though.
Well, when families come from a lot of other countries to live in a place like Missoula, and they live in, say, university housing or places where there may be a lot of other children around, but they're able to run out and go down to the playground or play in the yard and so forth. And if they're from a culture where it's just normal that they would do that alone, they may be at some risk here for being reported because that isn't the norm, and it's kind of a hard thing to learn because you don't want to frighten people and tell them their children are at risk. But on the other hand, there's a different reality here. Okay. So some of the changes that have occurred in my field in developmental psychology have to do with gradually coming to a realization that psychology for many, many years was sort of trying to ignore cultural differences, and instead that was just confusing things. Let's just try to seek what we might think of as the norms for human behavior and not worry about these cultural variations. Fortunately, that's changed, and as it's changed, the goals of our theories have changed. So instead of just searching for these universals, people began to say, well, let's look for some of the differences and see what we can glean from those differences that might be really informative and valuable. And then ultimately the goal of cross-cultural psychology would be to try to integrate those two, to try to address both of those. Yes, we want to look at diversity and differences. We also want to see if there maybe are some universals. And by universals, I mean things like usually motor development, physical development isn't as influenced by culture unless it's a result of nutritional variation. Language development, the outcome in terms of what language a child speaks, obviously, is where the variability comes in. but every child comes into the world prepared to learn a language or more languages and to prepare to communicate. So it may be sign language, it may be French, it may be Swahili, but every child is prepared as an infant unless there's some serious cognitive or auditory impairment to pick up the language that's surrounding them. So this earlier research that I mentioned, focusing on universals, trying to find universals in our research, would often simply say, well, let's study academic achievement or motivation in children and compare classrooms in Japan and classrooms in Kenya and classrooms in New Zealand. Just same study, same methodology, just comparing these different settings. The result of that, or one of the flaws in that, is that it doesn't adapt the measures to the local culture. That makes it difficult to do the research, or more difficult to do the research. But it's absolutely imperative that there be some cultural awareness and adaptation before you go in and do research in other cultures, other contexts. And most of this research that I'm referring to was developed in Western research settings. So there just wasn't initially a lot of concern about these issues of validity. Were the measures we were using valid in all of the cultures that we were studying? So gradually the shift was to try to find measures and ways of methodology that would be more sensitive to cultural variations, so that we weren't just trying to document differences and say, well, this culture, children are more focused on ability in order to achieve in school, and this culture, they're more focused on effort in order to achieve. Those are maybe important differences, but we need to go deeper and look at what might lead to those differences. And so part of what I'm getting at here is that having Western psychologists or scientists go in and try to do this research in other cultures without having some insights themselves about these variabilities is really going to potentially underestimate some of the cultural differences or undervalue them. And so we have to not only include the researchers from other cultures and have them inform the methodology, but we need to respect their perspectives as well. So here are just a few ways in which I think Western psychological theories have sort of fallen short, or ways in which our emphases are not necessarily shared around the world. There is, first of all, much more emphasis in most Western cultures on the child as an individual, not as part of a larger collective. Maybe more encouragement of self-expression. This sort of fits into the autonomy picture as well. Self-expression, allowing a child to express their opinions and maybe even talk back to their parents, or to indicate that they do or do not want to engage in some activity. And in some cultures that's really not allowed, just not permitted. And then the autonomy, the independence that I mentioned previously is really often seen in the United States as kind of the goal of child development. Now I want to focus a little bit more specifically at this point on infancy. There is a delightful book called The World of Babies that describes in each chapter a different culture around the world and looks at a lot of variations in how infants are raised in those cultures, and also begins with prenatal development and maternal care and that sort of thing. So I want to go through a few of those, the questions that are raised in this book and some of the variations that they talk about. So one of them is the idea that in many places around the world, it's believed that a child is born either with original sin, and these are often religiously based, as is pretty obvious, or they may be born divine and are a reincarnation of the ancestors. So if you believe any of those things, that can influence the way in which you treat this child from birth on. So if you believe, for example, that they're born with original sin, then your goal, your task as a parent is to make sure that they don't follow that path, that whatever you do eradicates them of that residue of original sin.
Can you explain what original sin is?
Well, original sin would be the idea that a baby kind of inherits the sins of the world, I want to say. I'm not sure whether that's a good definition. And maybe some others can address this as well. But the idea that a child isn't born naive and innocent and good, but that a child inherently has negative tendencies. I guess maybe that's a better way.
History of sin put it on them. So, yeah, ate the apple in the Garden of Eden, is
Right.
lying and tricky and doesn't obey orders and, fornicates and who knows.
Yeah, yeah,
What a horrible view. But
yeah.
truly a big view, though, for a lot.
For a lot of cultures, yeah. And so you can see, I think, how that might affect the way parents treat their babies or their children. Prenatal and birthing practices is another area that varies a lot around the world. For one thing, I mean, part of it is an economic difference, that prenatal care isn't always available, and hospital births are not as common in many parts of the world as they are here. But there are other differences as well, having to do with, for example, is the father or anyone else allowed to be present during a birth? When a mother goes into labor, is she alone? Is she in a hospital setting, a sterile kind of medical environment? Is she surrounded by village women who are supporting her and encouraging her? All of these different sort of social contexts that come into play there are very important, very powerful. And then after the baby is born, there are even questions about, well, is it important to talk to very young children? They can't talk to us, so why bother? Surely they can't understand much of what we're saying to them. So for many parents, it's considered sort of irrelevant. They talk to each other, they talk to the older children, but the babies are, in this regard, sort of ignored. They're not ignored in terms of their physical needs, but it's not considered important to talk to babies. How does that differ in families or cultures that you're familiar with? Observations right here in Missoula or in your own backgrounds.
Very interactive. I don't know. I was like talking, whether it's like baby talking, I don't know, or just, I don't know, just very interactive.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Well, it's really common to like hire a nanny, and I've been a nanny for a long time, and for like very small infants, you don't really have to do a lot, you know, the parents could just, you know, be working on their computer all day and just feed them every once in a while, but they sleep a lot. But I feel like parents, they go out and hire nannies so that there can be somebody who's interacting directly with the children and somebody who's talking to them a lot.
Isn't there a belief in this culture that you have to give them a foundation so that accustom them to the voices of the parents, but also accustom them to sounds and different speech so that they can pick up language? I mean, it's the belief that they'll pick up language eventually from hearing it.
Yeah.
I think almost with a tendency towards feeling like we can maybe accelerate their language if we talk to them a lot. And the way in which we talk to infants is very different than the way in which we talk to older children or other adults. I think you mentioned baby talk. So this sort of high-pitched, very pitch variable kind of talk, a lot of repetition and so forth. It turns out that that's actually important for babies, and that it does help them tune into who's my mommy, who's my daddy, who are the important people in my life. And it also conveys emotion and conveys, you know, your tone of voice changes if you're reprimanding a child as opposed to when you're praising them for something they've done well. So language input in most Western families is considered to be pretty important. But again, if another way in which this is different around the world is that if a baby is being carried on someone's back almost all the time, they will hear, there's that incidental learning, they'll hear language around them in the marketplace and on the bus and on the streets and so forth, but it may not be addressed to them. So that's another difference. They're getting language, but it's not so much directed from the caregivers. Things like bathing and toilet training, again, these are going to vary a lot from culture to culture, partly because there are many places in the world where there's not going to be running water or electricity or availability of water for bathing regularly and sanitation and so forth. So by virtue of the environment they're living in, getting back to that developmental niche, it's a combination of the physical reality and the necessity of daily life in these different cultures. And another difference that's kind of interesting, I mentioned that perhaps one of the universals we might think about is motor or physical development. But in fact, that's not always encouraged, that sort of autonomy of, oh, I'm so excited because my baby's starting to walk or stand up. And you know, in a lot of families that's encouraged, and it's exciting, and you want to take videos and all of that. When the baby takes the first steps, that's a step towards autonomy and separation and independence. But if this child is living in an earth floor hut or a place where there are snakes and insects and dangerous animals around, not to mention dirt, they may not be encouraged to be on the floor or to learn to walk so early. There may, of necessity, be restrictions because you need to protect the child from those physical risks. So we don't think normally about motor development as being that different from culture to culture, but whether this autonomy part of it is encouraged does vary from place to place. And here's an example in this picture of not only, do parents often carry their babies on their backs in the first few years, but older siblings, usually sisters. This child is probably only, I would say, 6 or 8 years old, and she's already trained to carry her baby sister on her back. Feeding practices vary tremendously. Even in Missoula or in this country, from family to family, that's going to vary. Is it preferable to breastfeed a child? We may know that medically it's advisable, but for many career women, that's a difficult challenge. For how long? Should it be just for the first 3 months when the mother is maybe on maternity leave? Or should it be for the first 3 years, which is much more common in many places around the world? Sleeping patterns, I mentioned this before. In the United States, most pediatricians, I think, recommend that at a pretty young age, maybe not right after birth, but pretty young, children are put in their own beds, a crib or maybe a bed in another room with siblings. But it's not so common to recommend that babies sleep with their parents. But this is not universal by any means. It's much more prevalent around the world for babies to sleep with their parents or with a whole bunch of other kids. You know, there might be 6 of them in one bed together. And again, it's part of the physical reality and the economic reality, perhaps, for many families. Daily schedules and caretaking, you mentioned earlier having nannies, and the sort of comparison to that or comparable situation in a lot of places is not someone who's hired necessarily, but a niece or a cousin or someone who is part of the extended family who lives with the family after a child is born and helps with child care. The question of where this takes place has to do with whether it's expected that this is going to be in the home or whether it's acceptable for the child to be put into daycare or in a child care situation outside of the home at a pretty early age. Some of the things that we've talked about already, such as whether a child is allowed to be down on the floor, crawling around, or learning to walk, being exposed potentially to dangers, it has to do with preventing illness and potentially even preventing death. But the other part of this is, how do we interpret the causes of illness or death? If you believe that your child is the reincarnation of ancestral spirits, part of that may also involve believing that if your child has a disability or has behavioral difficulties, that you are somehow being punished for past sins yourself or past crimes, so to speak. So the way you interpret a child's illness and what you do to intervene may be influenced by this belief system that we talked a little bit about earlier. And then there's this idea of, or the question of whether the goal of child rearing should be to develop a strong, autonomous individual or someone who is much more connected to and related to the larger community. Now, a few other cultural differences. One I wanted to mention here, the last one about naming babies, is something that I became very aware of in Ethiopia, because babies typically are not given names until they have reached the age of 40 days. Any thoughts about why that might be the case?
Probably like I mean, they might not live that long in developing countries. So, I mean, why name it if it's gonna not live till at least 40 days?
That's exactly right. That the infant mortality rate is so high that actually does influence certain child-rearing practices. And so the belief is that within, you get the child beyond the first month or month and a half, and they should be healthy enough and robust enough. They've proven kind of that they are going to survive. And so then it's sort of safe to give them a name and to make that investment in the personhood of this child. So we've been talking about infants. Let's shift now a little bit and talk about later development. One of the big differences that we see around the world is that adolescence, what we know as the teenage years, is not by any means a universal stage of development. There are many places around the world where adolescence would be, as we know it, would be considered such a luxury that it's kind of unimaginable, because a child literally needs to help sustain the family, go out to work, whether it's herding the sheep or bringing in hay or drawing water. They need to help contribute to the welfare of the family, beginning at a very early age. Remember the picture of the 6 or 8 year old child carrying her baby sister? That's part of this. That if that's her primary role, starting at that age, that child probably is not going to school. And so puberty, the biological changes, yes, that might be considered universal. But what we talk about as adolescence is much more related to the culture that we're referring to. And along with that, with adolescence, we think of rites of passage in many different parts of the world. So there might, can you think of, do you know of some rites of passage in different cultures that you might think of, including our own, your own? Graduation. Graduation, like from high school? Mm-hmm.
You have to get your driver's license.
I think driver's license is, yeah.
This country, 15 and a half. Trainer's permit, training permit, the other one is at 16.
Yeah.
I was thinking also of female circumcision or female genital mutilation, which can, depending on the culture, occur and is a rite of passage into womanhood.
Right. Yeah. And certain rites of passage for boys to supposedly enter manhood or to be considered part of the men of the tribe. So these vary around the world, and I think, when you consider getting a driver's license, and I think that's right, that is sort of a common rite of passage in many families. But it's so far removed from the rites of passage in a lot of indigenous cultures around the world. Okay, a little bit of history here. Why is it that in the Western world we began to, over time, separate children from adult activities? It used to be the case that children in this country and in Europe would also start working at a pretty young age, whether it was on the farm or in the mines or factories and so forth. But then the Industrial Revolution came along, And the environment, the work environment became so dangerous in many of those instances with a lot of mechanization, a lot of technology, that people began to realize children needed to be protected from some of those dangers. And so that's when we began to see this sort of, not split exactly, but separation, where children were more likely to be at home or in school and less likely to be part of the workforce at a young age. But then another part of learning how to be a member of the working force in a culture is apprenticing, or being an assistant, learning by doing, learning by following your dad around on the tractor, or learning by going to work occasionally with mom or dad, and being able to actually have some sort of apprenticing experiences. This gets back to that informal learning idea. It's not necessarily considered appropriate for children to be apprenticing in a formal sense at an early age, but certainly they're learning a lot about what it means to be a member of the workforce in their society. Okay, now a few comments about developmental stages in general, and I think I'm going to need to speed up a little bit here. Let me just see because I have a couple of short video clips I really want to get to. So I'm going to skip this because I think we've sort of covered some of these things already. Developmental stages and some cultural comparisons. Prenatal, I talked about a bit. One of the things that varies also is whether or not pregnancy is considered to be something that's okay to be sort of publicly acknowledged and known, or whether it's considered to be very private, not in a shameful sense, but in just a sense of modesty. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. Infancy, we talked about the high mortality rates, motor development, whether a child is allowed to crawl or be on the floor, language development. So I think we've touched on most of these points. This is one we haven't really talked about yet. So in early, middle childhood, say the elementary to middle school years, the question that is asked here is whether or not children are expected to and allowed and encouraged to play. Is it important to have a fantasy life? Is it important to engage with toys and learn how to construct things that don't have any purpose except being fun and pleasurable? And again, this is sort of a luxury for many places, for many families, to allow children and really encourage them to play. It's not just that it's a luxury to, that they get boxes and boxes of Legos every year for Christmas, but it's a luxury to allow them the time to play as opposed to herding the sheep or taking care of the younger siblings. But in terms of, from the perspective of developmental psychology, I would assert that play actually is important, and that it's an important way for children to develop social skills as well as cognitive and some physical skills. So in that regard, play doesn't always mean that it has to include store-bought toys. So children in developing countries are playing often with each other with things that they create from sticks and stones and old bicycle tires, and learning to engage with each other and learning to share and learning to negotiate conflicts and so forth. So that's all part of play. I think sometimes we confuse play with kind of material acquisitions of toys, and that's not necessarily the case. Adolescence, you know, getting back to this idea of adolescence being sort of a luxury, we often think of adolescence as a period of time that's very stressful and full of turmoil, and this term storm and stress has become part of the literature about adolescence for many years now. Again, it's not universal and it's not inevitable. If you don't have a concept of adolescence, if children, when they reach maybe high school age, really have to make decisions about going to work or pursuing a career path right away, they don't have the luxury of this period of time that's just sort of a prolonged hiatus between childhood and adulthood. And so it's not necessarily a time of upheaval. It depends on what your expectations are. And then in terms of adulthood, I would just remind you that we have to always think about the historical context, the cohort in which a person has developed. Are they impacted greatly by, say, some conflict in their country or some upheaval in their family, or an earthquake or something traumatic that happened for their cohort in general, not just themselves individually? So this idea of historical trauma is an important one. And what this means is that the expectations of different generations may vary from one cohort or generation to the next. Okay, old age. When do we consider a person old? And is a person who is old considered to be old and feeble or old and respected? These are things that have changed from culture to culture, as well as certainly over the years. And with that, I think I want to show you this first video clip. So I'm going to let... Yes, let's do that first.
I will do my best.
Okay. Okay, should I get out of this? Maybe no, maybe not need.
I'll just
Don't need
escape
to.
for now.
Okay.
And then let's try saying play.
And the class ends at 8.
It is the Baka way.
8:20.
Oh, okay, great.
A child who knows that she is valued, who knows that she can rely upon those who care for her, will learn to care for others.
Okay, that was Guinea. This is Italy.
A nursery school in the north of Italy. 3-year-olds perform Pinocchio.
The ability to identify with the feelings of others. The power that language confers to think about and describe the world. A moral sense to guide behavior. A sense of self that enables the child to become an actor upon the stage of his own life. These are just some of the 3-year-old's achievements.
Elsewhere in Italy, in still another nursery school, some children grab at a microphone that won't leave them alone.
A short time ago, they were utterly dependent infants. But in only 3 years, the normal course of maturation provides children with an astonishing catalog of abilities. Now, with help from each other, they begin to use their new capabilities to explore the wider world and all its mysteries.
Ancora, 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 ancora del microfono, ancora del microfono. Non si chiama microfono, si chiama microfono.
Their achievements do not come cheap. Much is required of parents and of society. The labors they must undertake on behalf of children cannot be the product of anything less than love.
Ancora.
Are you ready to stop?
Yes,
You want to go back to this?
yes. And then I'll try the DVD at the very end.
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you. Great. Oops, maybe not.
Oh, okay. I gotta push more buttons, okay.
Okay. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so first let's just talk very briefly about this and then we'll come back to it at the end. Differences you notice in these, not only the physical environment obviously, but the social environment, the developmental niche for these children. First little kids were in Guinea.
Where were the kids in Guinea? Were they at a preschool or were they at home?
At home.
They're at home.
Patient.
Okay, so,
Yeah.
so their education or their early preschool would be at home. That's
Right.
interesting, not in a special preschool like in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a lot of stuff to play with in Guinea?
No.
Yeah, nothing. It's like he's picking at her dress or, he's poking her, but they're playing with each other, but there's no toys, there's no puppets, and then, were there a lot of adults around in Guinea? Yeah, she's shaking her head, no adults. Yeah, so, oh my gosh, very different than the preschool we saw in Italy. Wow.
And, it's hard to tell from this because we didn't have subtitles for the first part, the Guinea clip, but the language was pretty sophisticated for the children in Italy. I mean, they were playing with language, they were trying to teach each other how to pronounce words and so forth, but they were clearly communicating with language. And the children in Guinea probably were too, but it was a little harder to detect that from the video. We saw more of the physical kind of interaction.
I was impressed in Italy that they're actually acting the puppets' lives, right? So it's not just their own life, but they can take the role of others and like be the little characters and interact with the characters, which is, to me, seems like a higher level of skill.
Yeah.
Even at 3 years old, I mean, I think that to me even seems really young to be doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's pretty young, but I think that, you may have had this experience in Germany also, that there's a lot more emphasis I found in Germany and Austria, where we lived when our kids were little, that there's a strong emphasis on fantasy and imagination and acting out, dramatic play, not acting out in a negative sense, but dramatic play with puppets or figures and dolls and so forth. So that may be part of it. But. Okay, so try to keep these images in mind. And I want to, at the end, I'm going to go through a little bit more content here, And then I want to show you one more video, which is a little bit different. So beginning to kind of wrap things up here, one of the things that I think is hardest for us to do, to handle sometimes when we try to think and think about and understand different cultures, is that there's a tendency to assume that the way we were brought up and the way our culture sort of dictates that children should be raised is the right way, and that's the way it's done. And we don't think about it. We don't really question why is it that children should sleep separately from their parents, and why is it that the father is not involved in child rearing in many places. So we don't stop and question those assumptions, and that makes it difficult to open our minds to understand and appreciate other cultures sometimes. The other thing is to realize that cultures change just as children develop and become different people as they grow up. Cultures develop too. Cultures change over time. Technology, think about how cell phones and the internet and social media are impacting cultures pretty much all over the world, I would say. I mean, it seems to me that in Ethiopia and other places, maybe you've seen this also, Teresa, that even in the most remote villages where there are very few services of any kind or infrastructure, people have cell phones. And it has opened up communication tremendously. And I don't think we know yet what the impact of that is going to be, but it certainly has made help people have access to information about what's going on in their country, for example, whether it's conflict or advances, than was ever possible before. So cultures change, the people within them change, obviously, and whenever we identify a practice such as not naming a child until 40 days within a particular culture, we have to realize that that's not going to be the same for everyone within that culture either. There'll be a lot of people who have either changed their minds about that, decided that maybe their access to medical services is sufficient, that they're very confident their baby's going to survive, and they name the baby right after birth. So be aware of these variabilities, both within cultures and across cultures. And then the last point here, that we have to avoid thinking that our way is the right way, and simply be open in our minds to respecting and appreciating and valuing other cultural practices as well. It doesn't mean that in doing so we give up our own values, or we abandon the practices that we were brought up with, or that we see in our family, our culture, our religion, our communities. Doesn't mean that at all. Learning from others simply means opening our minds to valuing others. And sometimes we may find ourselves thinking, I just don't think that's right. I just don't think that's a good practice. And I would say, in some cases, like Teresa mentioned, female genital mutilation, I would agree. I cannot accept that that's a good practice under any circumstance. But in most of these cases, we're talking about differences that are maybe not quite as powerful or as impactful as that. So I guess my point here partly is that rather than judging these practices in other places or other families, we need to try to understand them. So if you see a child from a family that's just moved to Missoula and their children are behaving very differently than what you would expect from a 10-year-old or a 2-year-old from your own family, before you judge, stop and think about that and try to understand what kind of developmental niche that child has come from in their home country.
I mean, before we get to the video, you're coming up with such important lessons for development workers too, because, you know, we can't go in and, you know, insist on all the kids going to school if the economic reality is that they need the children fetching water or caring for their siblings or maybe even working to support the family. By that same token, you know, who's to say that our views of breastfeeding are the only right ones? You know, you need to be very aware of the culture. Or even, like in terms of health, the causes of illness. Like, we may have a very science-oriented view of the causes of illness, but other people may think it's coming from, you know, some evil spirit. And so, you know, how can you either merge the two or, you know, work with that context and not just put, you know, try to put your values or your practices on them, but, you know, kind of reshape your own practices or advice to match that culture. So really, I think super important.
I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds me, I'll just tell you a very quick anecdote from my experience as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was teaching in a middle school, 7th and 8th grade, and there came a time when one of the little boys in my class, who was a good student, very responsible, and not one I would expect to be just kind of sloughing off, he didn't appear in class for a couple of weeks, and I was worried. He lived pretty far from the village where the school was, so I assumed he had gone back home for some reason, and maybe there had been a death in the family or whatever. Finally, he came back to school, and he came up to me very apologetic, very contrite, and he said, "Oh, Miss, I'm so sorry. I couldn't get back to school. I was at home, and I climbed a tree, and I saw a snake, and the snake gave me the evil eye, and I've been sick ever since." And I thought that was the best excuse I'd ever had from a student for not being in class.
I haven't gotten any excuses like that.
Yeah.
I might actually give them a free absence if they say that.
Right.
Wow. Well, let's see if
Okay.
we can get the video to play.
All right, so what I'm going to show you now, while Teresa's setting it up, this is the one from the DVD here, right? This is in the village where I served as a Peace Corps volunteer, and this is a visit I made back to that village in 2007. And first I'll show, there'll be a very short, just a few seconds, you'll see the class, the school where I taught, and then you'll see a kindergarten class that's been developed since then. And it's actually been developed by the sister of one of my former students. And I wanted to show you this kindergarten class to have you think about the difference between it and what we saw in the Italian preschool.
Excellent. So let me
Just click on the right there. No, there it is.
Is there a sound?
Yes, there should be.
Well, we might get to look at the pictures.
Well, it's still.
Turn the lights down.
So this is the kindergarten director, and oh, we've got to have sound. That's not going to give you the. That's okay.
So, I mean, it's up as high as it can go here.
And what about down here?
Oh yeah, but we had sound for the other.
Yeah, we did, but it's not
It's
showing
gone.
it now.
Yeah, I'm
Is
sorry.
there anything with the remote for up there?
No, not that I see. I'm sorry. Well, maybe AD mute? No, that's
Nope.
not it. That's even worse.
Oh dear.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
don't think that we
okay.
have sound.
Okay, all right, well, I'll just talk you through this then. So this is, just keep in mind, this is one kindergarten class in Ethiopia in 2007.
Wow, it's pretty crowded.
Any idea how many children might be in this class?
Wow.
100?
They were close to 80. Yeah. Beautiful children. And you see how quietly they're sitting? They're not wiggling and squirming and elbowing each other and jumping around and climbing over the desks. This little girl is starting to sing a song, and then they all, what I wish you could hear is that they all chime in. They're all singing together. And they're singing the, in their language, Frere Jacques.
Why do you think that they're so well behaved, and just kind of sitting there calmly?
I would throw that question out to you, because when I have shown this to my colleagues in the psychology department, they have said, where are the ADHD kids? How can this be? They're not on medications, that's for sure.
Well, let me get the lights and then
Okay,
tell us what you think of this video. Sorry again about
well,
the sound.
that's all right.
Hey, I'm glad that we got the rest of the technology working.
Yeah. So what would your thoughts be? Can you imagine going into a kindergarten or preschool in Missoula with 80 little kids in an area about the size of, I don't know, these first 3 rows maybe, and having them all, nobody's crying, nobody's hitting each other or squirming around. But what else is what's lacking in the classroom? What would you normally expect to see in a preschool or kindergarten classroom?
Distractions.
Distraction,
Toys and, yeah,
noise, yeah.
toys.
Toys,
Yeah,
yeah, toys and
yeah, everything,
crayons or art materials, things on, pictures on the wall, instructional activities.
I wonder if they're just in awe of actually getting to go to school and in awe of the authority figure of the teacher or a foreigner with a camera.
Yeah, that probably is part of it.
On their best behavior because they're so stunned by that.
Yeah. It's kind of a puzzle to me actually too, and yet I wasn't surprised when I went in there and I was standing there and interacting with the teacher and these children. It just felt totally normal. It was afterwards I looked at this and I thought, oh my gosh, how can this be? And it's not.
Are we so independent here, and we encourage so much independence in kids and having their own sense of identity or their ability to tell little stories and stuff that we don't, so much always value the sitting quietly and behaving.
Yeah. And everything, I think that's a good part of it, because everything that they were learning instructionally from the teacher was as a group. So if they're learning the alphabet, they're all saying the alphabet together, all 80 of them, or numbers, or singing these songs, or reciting poems. And so there isn't as much focus on each individual child.
I have to say, Lynn, I really noticed that in Thailand too, in the classroom, the independence versus cooperative.
Yeah.
So I thought that the Thai students were much better working in groups because that's what they always did. And so to work independently or think independently was really foreign.
And so, they would like to all submit the same homework, which was written by the smartest student, and then everyone else
Yeah.
copied, right?
Yeah.
And that was cooperation, that was what was good. And I'm like, no, you have to write your own, you write your own, and
Yeah.
so it's very
Yeah.
different
That's-
learning style and a
Mhm.
different, thing that had been rewarded in the school system.
Yeah.
So I think that's
That's a good illustration too, yeah.
Do you have any other questions for Lynn? I thought, great experience in Ethiopia, and want to know more about what she was doing in Ethiopia back in the day. How many years ago?
46, 47, yeah. Yeah. Long time ago.
She's being modest, but she's been helping this university start a relationship with University of Gondar in Ethiopia. And so there's a Fulbright scholar from Gondar here now, and some people from here have already gone there, and so we're hoping to get a little bit of an exchange going, and that's,
Right.
I think, Lynn and her husband's doing. So that's good.
Thank you.
Well, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you.